here today with Asheesh Advani. Asheesh, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. I was looking forward to doing this episode with you.
It's great to be here with you, Gary.
And we've had so many discussions and so many conversations over time, and I thought, what better way to do that than actually with our audience present and learn a little bit more about you, your path, as well as Junior Achievement. It's one of the largest not-for-profits in the world, but yet not everyone knows it. The focus is specific, and sometimes the audience tends to be specific. But I think it's a hidden gem. Maybe I'm a little partial, but a hidden gem that I think most people need to know about. But let's start a little bit with Asheesh. So Asheesh, tell us a little bit about your story, where you grew up, your upbringing, and sort of how did Asheesh end up here today?
Sure. So I was born in India, but I grew up in Canada. I know many of your listeners are Canadian, and you live in Canada as well. So I spent my formative years really in Toronto. I went to elementary school, middle school, and high school in Toronto. And then I went to university in the States, eventually married an American woman and now live in the US. I had some detours along the way. I did I did graduate school in England and did some professional work in India as well along the way. How I ended up in my current role, though, maybe is an even better story than that. So I'm really a tech entrepreneur by background, Gary. I don't know if you know that because you've only known me from my JA world. But for most of my early career, I started my career... I'm sorry?
I remember that from the early days of your of your previous background, but I certainly wanted to know that for the purpose of the audience.
Yes, so I'll tell a couple of good stories. How about that? I'm not going to go over the whole background, but I started my career actually at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And when I was working at the World Bank, I had a business idea because I was looking at the ways that small businesses raise money in the world, particularly in the developing world, where they don't have credit cards, or at least in those days, they didn't really use credit card financing. People borrow money from friends and family. So they borrow money typically in the form of these startup, either loans or gifts from friends and family. So the World Bank was sizing that market. And I realized how big it really is. What sometimes is called informal financing is, huge. So it was the early days of the internet. And I thought, how can we use the internet to bring better outcomes for all these informal transactions? So we built a business called CircleLending, which did peer-to-peer loans, person-to-person loans, initially for businesses, but then also for education loans, for debt refinancing, for mortgages and home loans. And we realized that people borrow money from other individuals for so many different things. And the internet allowed it to become done in a way that actually helps both parties. So we built this business which moved money between parties, provided legal documentation, was like a third-party intermediary for all these person-to-person loans. And we built this, and it grew to be, a new product category. And it was the early days of what's now called fintech. In fact, we coined the term social lending in the New York Times in the early days. And the company was bought by Virgin, Richard Branson's Virgin Group. So really, at a very young age, I had this wonderful opportunity to basically work for Richard Branson. And, for an entrepreneur, if you can't think of a better person to buy your business, right? So many people look up to Richard. So that was, I would say, one of my early experiences with entrepreneurship, at least one that worked out. I've got many failure stories too, Gary. So if you want me to keep talking, I'll keep talking, but I'll stop at the success until you ask me about the failures.
Well, I think the important thing about the failures is that we learn from them, and you clearly learn. Otherwise, you would have not end up in an organization that got bought out by the Virgin Group. So.
Well, I'll just tell you one failure story. So before I started that business, I tried to start a business called The Business Minor. It's ironic given what I do now at Junior Achievement, but I wanted to teach business courses to students who weren't majoring in business. And I figured there were college kids who are majoring in like physics or English or history or engineering who would love to have a minor in business. And in those days, a lot of the top universities didn't offer undergraduate programs in business. So we started to create one. I was studying at the Wharton School, so I felt I had some credibility because Wharton had an undergraduate program in business. Recruited a bunch of professors and did it with a business partner. And we realized that apparently nobody wants to spend extra money after spending money on college tuition, particularly in the US where it's really expensive, to spend extra money on getting a minor degree from a private organization. So I just didn't do the market research, frankly. It sounded like a great idea. I was like a proper product guy. I just was in love with my own idea. And I kept persevering through it, but did no market research to figure out if people would actually spend the money on it.
And Asheesh, that's, I mean, the typical entrepreneurial story, that ideas are important, and then the right idea is so important, but validating it accordingly is key. And again, those failures are important because we learn from them.
Well, one thing I learned from that failure, Gary, is when you work with a business partner and things start to go wrong and south, it really strains the relationship. And this was a close friend of mine. I realized, it's actually very tricky to start a business with somebody. So what I did the second time around is I really did it myself, and I hired people who I considered co-founders, but I was the primary driver. And that was really important life learning for me. I'm not sure if you've got your own stories around that, Gary, but a lot of people I think have kind of founder stories to share.
Oh, and believe me, I've had my own failures and my own learnings along the way. So, and many for another day when we do episode 2 of this podcast. And Asheesh, I want to go back a little bit to your sort of earlier days. Who do you think had the biggest impact on you personally and professionally growing up? And I use growing up more loosely, including sort of in your career.
Well, one of the things I've learned over my life is you need to find people who push you. And there have been people in my life at various times who I think have been achieving so much more than me, or having a different lifestyle that I wanted to learn from. In the early days, my brother pushed me. Actually, I've got an older brother, and he got into Harvard, and he was working so hard. And I always looked up to him, and he was the person who I considered a role model. And then when I got to university, there was a good friend of mine who also, he took 8 courses in one semester. And when I saw him do that, I said, hey, maybe I can do that. So both of us took 8 courses. And then the dean called us into her office and said, you need to drop 2 courses because you're taking too many. Our rules are you can only take 6. And we said, we've done the work. This was December of the semester. So there's only 2 or 3 weeks left in the semester. She said we need to drop the courses. And to make a long story short, we found a way to get the professors to count them in a future semester. So in the end, our work wasn't lost. But I tell the story only because if you don't find people who are doing more than you, I think it's a lost opportunity to push yourself. And that's one of the lessons that we have in the book which I recently wrote, which hopefully we get a chance to talk about as well, Gary.
Well, and Asheesh, I wanted to ask you about the book, but since we're here on it, tell us a bit about the book, and then what was the impetus behind it as well?
Yeah, so the book is called Modern Achievement. It just came out in August. It's been such a labor of love. I've co-authored the book with Marshall Goldsmith, who's a very well-known leadership thinker and #1 ranked thought leader in the Thinkers 50 group. And all of Marshall's books are bestsellers. So I was a little bit terrified because I really thought this would be the one book that would not be a bestseller, and the one that he wrote with me. And I would just, I had all the usual imposter syndrome kind of feeling. And I'm so happy it just got selected as an international bestseller, which has taken so much pressure off, Gary. I've been doing quite a few podcasts, I will tell you, and I feel the pressure's off. So now I don't have to talk about the book if you don't want to, Gary, because I've already jumped the hurdle. I feel the nervousness is much less. But I will say that the reason we wrote the book, to answer your question, is because the definition of achievement needs to evolve. Most books about achievement are about long-term goal setting and visualization and writing down long-term goals. But a person graduating from a university or from high school today is going to have many jobs and many different careers. On average, 20 different jobs and 7 different careers on average. That means the idea of goal setting, long-term goal setting, means something totally different. Achievement is about having many goals, allowing you to pivot and really enjoying the journey. Many of us, Gary, who've got the benefit of perspective, know that our happiness comes not from goal attainment, but from enjoying the journey and the process of getting to the goal. So with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that young people are going to have a very different kind of career in the future. That's what was the motivation to write a book about that.
Well, and Ashish, it's so important, and the journey matters so much because it's not like winning the lottery. When you attain something, it's the fruit of labor that is often can take at a minimum months, but often years. And because that's the case, when you get there in the final destination, not that it shouldn't be celebrated, but you could see it coming. Like it's not something that happens overnight, and this is why I compare it to it's not like winning the lottery. So it's so important to enjoy the journey along the way because it's a critical component to smelling the flowers, as people will call it sometimes, and not just focusing on I'll be happy when I get there because it's seldom the case.
Well, the lessons that come from that perspective are actually quite different than most books. So, for example, we've organized the book into 30 lessons. Each lesson's about 10 pages, so very accessible. And a lot of people are buying the book, turns out, on Audible, because then they can listen to it in the car, and they do it with their kids or with their family in the car. So they almost have a discussion about it by virtue of it being played. And one of the lessons in the book is to make friends 5 to 10 years older than you. It's such a concrete lesson. I actually learned it from a young person who told me that this is what helped them succeed in their early career. And if you're going to have many jobs and many careers, you're going to have to be very, very intentional and good about networking. A lot of young people have friends who are their peers, and they don't think about making these role models and mentors and other friends who are just a few years older. So I thought that was an example of a great concrete lesson that if you play it in the car with your kids, it leads to a conversation.
Well, and Ashish, that specific piece of advice has come up on this podcast. Get mentors, get people you can learn from. And I think getting as practical and as tactical as you have just suggested. So, hey, if they have 10 years plus of experience or ahead of you, that actually means that you can learn things that your peers may have not experienced yet. And that's why it's so critical.
Well, I think a lot of people say you should get a mentor. That's not a new piece of advice. But most people are terrified of asking for mentorship. They have some combination of being nervous about getting a no. And some people are just, I would say, somewhat lazy, frankly, about prioritizing it relative to other things. So by virtue of actually having friends, not mentors, who are 5 to 10 years older than you, which people are much less lazy about, I will tell you, people just love friends, right? Why not? The friendships are what lead to these mentorship moments. So you're never having to even ask somebody to be a mentor. They're just become one by virtue of your talking, like over a beer or after a game or after, something you've done together.
And it happens far more organically. So then it feels like you're doing social time and learning along the way. So it's great advice. Uh, and Ashish, from a target audience perspective, certainly I could see broad applications to this. Who did you intend as the audience?
Well, the original intention was people between the ages of 18 and 35. So really aspiring leaders is what we called it. What I've learned since the book has come out is more established leaders, people who've got a lot more experience in their career, are seeing value in the book in a way I didn't anticipate. Because when you write a book for one audience, I think, particularly if you're an established leader, if it was written for that audience, to some degree, if they don't like one of the lessons, they're like, oh, this book is not for me, or this, they sort of go back on their heels. But if it's written for a younger audience, they can pick and choose the lessons they like. And they're always thinking of either their kids or their colleagues or their friends or people in their family. And so they're reading it both for themselves and for somebody else. And that has really changed, I would say, the way the information is received. And the book has done really well. Also in markets, I didn't think it's top 10 in India at launch. I mean, that for me, as somebody who was born there, is really an amazing thing to see. And part of it is Marshall Goldsmith as well is really well known there. And, I've become a little bit better known because of JA's work there as well. So I think it's been really, I would say, surprising how much it's appealed to an audience that's beyond the original intended group.
Well, and I'm not surprised that it has resonated, Ashish, just knowing sort of the learnings of the book. I could see the value of it even at a personal level. So that's not, and I'm outside of the demographic, of the original demographic.
But you look young, Gary, you look young.
Ashish, the last question about the book, and it's and this is something that anyone that has written the book is can appreciate a bit more. But people that are aspiring to write books can say, how do you get that? How do you idealize, and then how do you actually materialize on writing a book? So the how did you get from idea to actually delivering on writing a book? Because I know it doesn't happen overnight.
Well, first of all, I strongly believe that everyone should write a book at some point in their life when they have something to say, right? Don't write a book just because you want to write a book and be an author. But when you're ready, I think that's why I think it gets a bad rap, because it's so hard, and you have writer's block, and you're constantly having to, get through barriers and obstacles to get the book done. But when you have something to say, it becomes so much easier. And I guess another thing that's happened is book publishing has changed. It used to be you needed an established publisher and you needed distribution into bookstores. Now that's no longer true. Online sales dominate how people get books. So really, you don't need to have an established publisher anymore. You can work with a hybrid publisher or self-publish it, or put it out in a series of blog posts or Substack, and then put it together as a book. And in my case, I really learned, frankly, from past books that I've done, where I used established publishers, where I couldn't get international distribution of the book because they kept saying no every time somebody wanted to do an edition of a book. In this case, we used a hybrid publisher called Amplify. And I'm so happy we did, Gary, because we're doing editions of the book now in China, across Europe, in places even like Lithuania has ordered, multiple thousand copies of the book, because they see the value of it. And I think it would have not happened if I used a traditional publisher, which just takes a long time to do these international editions. So that's one thing I've learned from the process. So for those of you who are listening in and are reticent to write a book, I'll say two things. One, when you're ready, it's much easier than you think.
No, and Ashish, it's great advice, and that's why I thought let me ask you about it, because I knew there were some learnings along the way that are worth sharing with the audience. And I want to go back to the Asheesh story. So we talked about exiting from the technology company, and it was a fantastic learning experience. How did you end up at JA, and what was that next part of the journey like?
Well, I've been at JA now for almost 10 years, Gary. It's quite amazing. And the reason I ended up here is because I did another company after CircleLending called Covestor, and that was acquired by a public company called Interactive Brokers. And I started to reflect on my life as to what I wanted to do next, and really what I'm good at and what I'm not so good at. I think, Gary, to be honest, I'm not that great at building companies. It sounds wonderful in retrospect to have these entrepreneurial successes, but they were not giant companies. So I realized that actually what I'm better at is I'm better at persuading people to support things, whether it's to raise money for a company, or to raise money for a nonprofit, or support an idea, or persuade people to get behind something. That's something I actually enjoy doing and something I'm good at. So how can I use that skill to do more for the world, to make a bigger impact, to create happiness for myself, for my family, for the communities that I serve? And Jay at the time was looking for a new leader. So it just happened to be, I think, great timing, where I put my name forward and I went through the interview process. And, it's been really the job of a lifetime. And I've just enjoyed so much the ability to meet young people. I think, you know this, Gary, because you serve and have served on multiple JA boards and are now our chair of junior achievement in Canada. The ability to reach young people at the time of their life where they're deciding who they are and who they want to become, it's such a powerful thing. It's so energizing. It's a way to give back that's just more powerful than I think most other ways to be generous. So for me, I get a chance to meet amazing people like you. I get a chance to meet amazing achievement-oriented young people that both of us get to meet around the world. And it keeps us young, but it also helps us be thoughtful about what we want for the future of the world and be able to influence it. And that is just a really rare opportunity.
And Ashish, you're right. It is indeed a rare opportunity, and one that I am very grateful for having had, much like you. But I want to let's not assume that our audience is intimately familiar with junior achievement. Would you mind giving us a really brief history of junior achievement all the way to now being an organization that is being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, and that's sort of inception to this type of achievement?
Well, I mean, JA has been in existence for over 100 years, so I'll try to summarize it quickly so we don't go through every decade, or we'll be here too long. So it was founded in 1919, just as World War One had finished, and young people were coming back from the war, and they dropped out of school, they dropped out of high school. So the organization was created to be about skill building, to allow young people to own their own economic success, to have the perspective to be able to start companies or to be employed and to feel they could really kind of own their own destiny. And from those early days, the programs were very much about business skills and entrepreneurship, which has always been part of our mission and always been core to what we do. Of course, now when we think of the future of work and the values that young people need, the leadership skills they need, the self-belief that they need, even the STEM skills that they need, we've expanded our mission over the years as we've globalized. So now we've gone from being an American organization, really operating only in one country, to operating in now over 120 countries. At last count, Gary, 123 countries we're now in. And our goal, by the way, is to get to 132 by the end of 2025. So we're growing, we're expanding. And the Nobel Peace Prize nomination, one of the things I'm most proud of, because it happened quite recently in the last few years, is it's allowed us to draw attention to the connection between peace, prosperity, and economic opportunity for youth, education. So you can't really have peace in the world unless there's prosperity for all communities. Lasting peace requires everyone to share in prosperity. You can't have prosperity without having young people truly have economic opportunity for themselves, for their family, for their communities. And education really is core to that. So what JA does is really, we marry education and economic opportunity by bringing business role models like you in connection with young people. So we connect young people to understand the meaning of what they're doing in school by connecting them to jobs, connecting them to role models, to business owners who've actually taken that education and done something with it. And we do that all over the world, as you know, Gary. And for your listeners who don't know, one of the amazing things about junior achievement, I'll just tell you one story if I could.
Please.
So when I was young, as I mentioned, I was born in India. So I got a chance to go back to India and see JA programs in India. And I got a chance to visit a program where we brought young 14-year-old girls. Imagine them as like the daughters of rickshaw drivers, right? Imagine these girls with their little ponytails and their school uniforms. They don't come from a wealthy background. We brought them to a GE healthcare for the day as like a career day kind of trip where they got to see, meet GE executives. So they got to see these presentations from GE executives. And they were like, the CEO spoke, and then the head of sales spoke, and they talked about their great careers. And then this woman stood up and said, I used to go to the same school as you. And now my job is to run nutrition for all the hospitals that are part of GE Healthcare in India, or in Mumbai. And so I give meals to sick people in hospitals. And I studied chemistry, and I went to university, and now I have this great job. And every girl in the room wanted to be her. Like, it totally gave meaning to study chemistry in a totally different way. We asked them at the end of the day, what do you think? And they all said, we want to study chemistry. We want to be like her. It was truly amazing. And so I think most of these girls, they only knew what their parents did or what their mom does and what their dad does and what their parents' friends do. They never met an executive who had this role. So this opened up their eyes to careers they didn't know existed. And that's one of my favorite things about junior achievement. I see this over and over again. I know you do because you've had a chance to travel as well. It's really quite amazing when you can impact the life of a young person by just a short intervention like that.
And Asheesh, we've had the opportunity to get this exposure, and we've been fortunate to do so and have seen this in action. For anyone listening that wants to learn more about JA and contribute in some way, whether financially or volunteer, what are the best ways to do that?
Well, one of the nice things about the organization is we're one of the biggest volunteer organizations in the world. We have hundreds of thousands of volunteers all over the world, including in the community that your listeners live in, because we've got JA chapters really all over the world. So you can get involved with your local chapter and you can speak in a classroom. If you work for a company that you think could be a good partner of JA, the way we work is we partner with companies. We make it really easy for individuals to become champions for their company to get others involved as well. There's something very gratifying about getting students come to your company for the day, or to get, for example, your executives to go into the classroom and share their stories and mentor kids. So I think one really easy way, and you can Google us in whatever country you live in or whatever city you live in, Junior Achievement. And we've got Junior Achievement Worldwide, which is the organization that I'm part of, which is the global organization. And then we have 340 other JA chapters all over the world. And we have connections to them online, of course, through our website. But I think in terms of ways to get involved, one of the things I say is you get so much satisfaction in life, so much happiness, frankly, about not only sharing your own story, but saying something nice to a young person, which can change their life trajectory. One nice comment, hey, you're a great public speaker, or I see you've got natural leadership skills, or I think you could really succeed in finance if you consider that as a career. One nice comment like that can change the trajectory of somebody's life. So I like to tell people that one way to get involved, if you don't have time to be on a board or don't have time to volunteer in the classroom, just to commit to say something positive to a young person in your life, to encourage them and to give them the confidence to have a business career. So that's my call to action for your listeners.
No, and it's so critical, Asheesh, and appreciate you sharing that, because it is something that we talk about, and we carry the JA flag wherever we go. But sometimes getting a little tactical and saying, here's how you can actually contribute is important. And Asheesh, I'm pivoting to something else. So certainly we talked about the book, and you have some of this advice there, but you've been an entrepreneur, you've been now in an executive role in a not-for-profit. What are some key learnings that you'd share with business people out there, executives, aspiring entrepreneurs, sort of keys to success, learnings that you're like, these are critical sort of nuggets that I'd like to share, whether in the book or otherwise, but just certainly an opportunity to speak to a broader audience?
Okay, so that's a big question.
I know.
As I mentioned, the book has 30 lessons, okay? So it's very concrete. For your listeners, I'm guessing many of your listeners are parents.
Correct.
So I'm going to actually pivot a little bit to a little bit of parenting advice. Because in a world which has 20 jobs and 7 careers, and by the way, not everyone's going to have, if you're a doctor or you go into dentistry or something, you may pick a path which is a little bit narrower and deeper. But for most careers, there's going to be quite a bit of change. And by the way, if you talk to doctors and dentists, they will tell you as well, things are changing very quickly in their field and they're having to pivot. But if you've got young people in your life, the parenting advice I would give you is it no longer matters as much as it did when you were growing up, what your first job is, or what university you went to, or whatever achievement thing that you might be chasing on behalf of your kids. So I want to take some pressure off you and your kids and not obsess so much about that, because what matters is actually mindset and skill set. So you need to have a mindset, if you're a young person, to be able to have the intellectual curiosity to move from job to job, what Manpower Group calls learnability. The ability to learn new things is such a core skill. So if you're gonna be anxious about something, be anxious about making sure your kids have that core skill, not as much what school they go to or what their first job is. The next thing I would say is, for your own life, as much as we'd like to take the things that we're good at and we want to share them with our kids, every young person is unique and different. And you need to let them be themselves, and you need to identify their strengths. And this is one thing which I'm learning, frankly, even at JA. I'll take my parenting hat off for a second and get off my soapbox. But for JA, we're seeing so many different young people who are gravitating to feel they're going to be entrepreneurs someday, much more so than when I was growing up. because what's happened is entrepreneurship's more popular. The idea of at some point in your life, you're going to have to be an entrepreneur, maybe not because you want to, but because you've gone through a transition and you need to be. Young people want way more creative control over their life and their choices than I think we had in our generation. So if I could also encourage, some of the parents who are listening to make sure your kids do have at least one entrepreneurial experience at a young age. I went through JA when I was in my teenage years, and I don't think I could have been confident to be a CEO in my 20s or my own business if I hadn't gone through that experience as a young person. So I really encourage, JA is not the only program. There's lots of great programs that allow you to develop these entrepreneurship early experiences. But I'd really encourage that amongst parents, even for kids who are not, quote unquote, business oriented. So I'll leave with those two, Gary.
No, Asheesh, extremely, extremely important. I do have one follow-up question, because both for the parents that want to know this for their kids, but also we'll have some young professionals that listen to the podcast. What are some tips on learnability, being sort of developing learnability, and how do parents make sure their kids are developing that skill, and how do professionals, young professionals or otherwise, because I think learnability is such an important skill throughout life, to make sure that that muscle is flexed consistently?
Yeah, I mean, intellectual curiosity, creativity, agility, learnability. Let me give you a few examples of how you can build the confidence in yourself to be able to have these qualities. Okay. I've already mentioned role models a lot. I'll mention a few other things. Surrounding yourself with people who encourage you is very important. And I think most young people aren't intentional about this. I think you've heard the phrase, you are aspiring to be what the 5 people around you want you to be. So if you pick 5 people around you who don't want you to be intellectually curious, who don't want you to be naturally creative or having agility in your life and be very fixed, it's going to be hard for you to all of a sudden discover that. So I think this intentionality of not only of your friends, but even your professional associates that you surround yourself with, I think is really important. Another one is turning negative thoughts into positive thoughts. So you know about self-efficacy, Gary, because we've talked about this before, but this idea of self-belief, which is more than self-confidence, it's the concept of self-efficacy. One way you build this concept of self-efficacy is you develop the muscle of turning negative thoughts into positive thoughts. This gives you the resilience to be able to move from job to job when things don't go right. Or you as an entrepreneur and as a business owner, Gary, it gives you the resilience to look for the positive when you have an obstacle in front of you. Look for the opportunity. And it's very easy to learn this. Most people think, I'm a born pessimist or I'm a born optimist and I'm not going to be able to pivot. But you can build this muscle. The way to do that is by picking 3 things that you're grateful for. Not 1, not 2, but 3. And to do it on a regular basis. Ideally, you do it daily, but I know some people can't start daily. But even start it weekly or monthly, doesn't matter. 3 things you're grateful for. By the time you get to the second thing or the third thing, you start the grateful with the words despite or even though. So despite the fact that it's cold outside here, I'm still getting a chance to live in this beautiful warm home and going out for dinner with my friends tonight. Right? So the negativity of the cold now becomes a positive. Or, even though we're running out of time in this podcast, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope it'll be useful to a lot of people. So you try one, Gary. I want you to turn a negative into a positive. You try one grateful for.
Well, and Asheesh, it's to your point, it's philosophy that is from our ancient times. But I will tell you, I am very, despite feeling like we have Canadian winters that make it gloomy all the time, I am very grateful to have a family that keeps it warm every time you go back. And it's like, this weather is irrelevant. The warmth comes from within. So.
Well done, Gary. So, that's the one takeaway I would have. If you want to build this natural agility in your life, you need to be able to turn negative thoughts into positive ones. And it's a muscle you can build with. It costs nothing, takes a few minutes. Do it with your kids, do it with your family. I tell you, it works every time.
Well, and to our listeners, you could do with your kids as Asheesh did just with me directly. It's challenge them to think that way and flex that muscle early on so they can actually get used to that. And it is a challenging time for our youth because we have things that most of our generation didn't have growing up, which is social media and impacts and pressures and bullying in avenues that didn't exist before. So actually thinking positively and getting beyond that is just so critical. Asheesh, really, really appreciate those nuggets because I think practical advice is just so critical, practical takeaways for the listeners. And Asheesh, I will come back to you with anything that I may have missed from our discussion today, but I want to go to a portion of our podcast that we call the rapid fire questions. And then I'll come back to you and say, Asheesh, what other thoughts did we not get to on this podcast that I should have? So the way the rapid fire questions work is I'll ask you a question, and then sort of first thing that comes to mind, quick, nothing to overthink, and they're meant to be fun and exciting. So the first one is, what is your favorite word?
Optimism.
And I could definitely see that. What word do you hate?
Oh man, mayonnaise.
Mayonnaise. What word do you have a hard time pronouncing, if any?
My name Asheesh. I actually, because I stutter, I cannot change that word, so I stutter on it all the time.
You have no trouble. But what is your favorite word in another language, if any?
That's a beautiful question.
Well, and which language is
Merci.
business, right? So, and
Merci.
Very, very thankful of you. How many languages do you speak?
One and a half. To English and half French.
And what's one word to describe yourself by?
I would say aspiring.
And Asheesh, I think I completely agree with it. And I think anyone that will read your book will see that through. And Asheesh, I promise I'll come back to you with any parting thoughts to our audience that I may have not gotten to, because that's when you have somebody like you on this podcast. This could be a 3-hour podcast, and I still have lots of questions to ask you. But as we try to distill the learnings for our audience, anything that you thought it's worth sharing that Gary didn't get to?
There's this practice that I've started to do more often. I learned it from Marshall Goldsmith. It's the practice of asking yourself active questions. It's a particular way to phrase a question to yourself. It's incredibly powerful. Let me give you an example. Have I done my best this week to be a good father? Have I done my best this week to get good at tennis? Have I done my best this year to be a good leader for my organization? The reason this is a powerful framing is it's all about your personal responsibility. So for example, if I haven't been able to practice tennis because it's raining outside or cold outside now, it's not an excuse. I've still done my best. I can still answer yes. It's a little bit different than saying, am I better at tennis? Have I practiced this week? It avoids all the stuff that's outside your control. And I think it's a very powerful framing, Gary, particularly for your listeners and maybe for people who are really aspiring to be better, because it doesn't make you feel guilty. It's one of these ways of asking a question that allows you to be honest with yourself. Have I done my best? And sometimes you haven't, and that's okay. But it definitely has influenced my behavior. It's made me, frankly, I think a better father, because the way I ask the question allows me to return to making sure next time I ask it, the number goes up.
Well, and Asheesh, it's such an important piece of advice. And to your point, this has been versions of this have been around since the Stoics, and it is such that it really drives our behavior to be tough on ourselves and consistently improve, so that everyone that follows us, especially as leaders, has that inspiration of us self-improving, especially as we seek to inspire them.
Gary, you're a philosopher. I think I can learn from you. You're connecting everything I say to classics. I feel like we need another conversation about the connecting of the dots.
Well, and that's why I said this. It's hard to keep this episode concise because there's so much to connect on. But Asheesh, I really appreciate your time today. It's been fascinating listening to you. And one last small question for anyone wanting to get the book. Audible is certainly a great way to actually get it. I assume Amazon and any other avenue that people should know about.
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. That's the easiest because it's available everywhere on Amazon. Modernachievement.com has it's also available there. And I will say for your listeners, Gary, if they put in promo 20 as the discount code, they can get 20% off the book as well. So I wanted to share that in case if they go to modernachievement.com, they can save a little bit of money off Amazon. And I should mention all the proceeds from the book are donated to Junior Achievement. So it's a great opportunity for you to give to Junior Achievement. Of course, if any of your listeners want to make a donation, we're a nonprofit. All of our programs are free to students. So the only way we survive is by having philanthropists and companies support us. So they can do that in different ways on our website as well.
And what a great way, Asheesh, to do this. It's contribute to JA, learn something along the way. It's dual purpose. Asheesh, thank you again for the time today. It's been fascinating having you on the show, and I knew it would really resonate with our audience.
And thank you, Gary, for inviting me, and thank you for your service to the organization. I'm just so grateful on behalf of really everyone who works with me. Thank you.